you who do not know, Sierra Club BC is an environmental charity that recently celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2019. We acknowledge our accountability to learning from past mistakes, and we do invite you to read our statement of accountability called Balancing the Canoe, which is on our website. And Maya will share that in the chat for you if you'd like to take a look at that. Under the leadership of our Executive Director, Hannah Askew, we are working to fulfill our vision of a healthy, life-sustaining planet where humans respect the dignity and interdependence of all living beings. And that word interdependence is key to this webinar, as we will be talking about how forestry affects many just different aspects of our communities. So let's introduce our panelists today. We will have as our guest of honor, Dr. Peter Wood, who is the author of the report, Intact Forests, Safe Communities. Peter completed his PhD in forestry at the University of Toronto with a focus on the impacts of sustainable forest management certification in Canada. Over the past 2 decades, he has worked on a variety of issues related to forests and climate change, both internationally and within Canada, including the United Nations, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and the BC Ministry of Forests. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Next, unfortunately, our forest community liaison, Robin Strong, was supposed to be joining us today, but we have had to make a change as she is unavailable. So instead, we have our lead organizer, Flossie Baker. So welcome, Flossie. And of course, we also have our senior forest and climate campaigner and science advisor, Jens Wieting. Welcome, Jens. So, oh yes, and not to forget, we have Maya van Woudenberg, who is our communications co-lead, and she's going to be managing the Q&A box and any IT issues in the background. So thanks for your support today, Maya. So let's start with our first panelist, Peter, the author of Intact Forests, Safe Communities, to speak about the report and its findings.
Great, thanks a lot. And I'll share my screen here. Okay, so let's see, is that started yet? Okay, here we are. So I'll start off here by saying the report had sort of 2 main objectives. One was to provide us an overview of the scientific literature regarding the impacts that logging has on a variety of different climate impacts that are ongoing and anticipated, including fire and flooding. And then secondly, to make recommendations on how to improve the government of BC's response. And so this was in relation to the government issued preliminary strategic climate risk assessment, which was launched in July 2019. So this is a 500-page report, very, very comprehensive in many ways. And it sets out what the likelihood and consequence are of a variety of different impacts. And you can see there the 15 different identified risks. And so basically it was to evaluate what are the chances of these events happening, and what would be the consequence, how impactful would that be? So this study, we did a review of those identified risks, and we found that at minimum, there are 9 of these risks that have a very high likelihood of occurring that are related to logging, and several of those were rated as high risk. So you can see in that chart that cute little green tree beside each one of those ones that were identified as being related to forest management. And I think, big picture, I think what the overall finding was that it was quite surprising that there was actually no mention in 500 pages of a report on climate risk. There was no mention of the bearing that forest management has on the likelihood and consequence of these risks. And it's not to say that they completely neglected the forest industry completely. There's actually quite a detailed consideration of how climate change could affect the economic viability of the forest industry, but very little consideration of forestry's impact on these climate risks. So I'm going to step back a bit and look at the province here, because I think this context is very important. We are an incredibly diverse province. These are the 16 different biogeoclimatic zones. And as we know, forests in these zones are very different, behave differently, are subject to a very different type of natural disturbance. And that is very important context to keep in mind. The other context for BC is that there are very few remaining forests that have yet to be logged within the timber harvesting land base. And the other context, which I'm quite familiar with, is the road networks that have been created to support industry. So we have hundreds of thousands of kilometers of roads, and that makes a lot of these forest areas quite accessible. So right now, I'm going to give you quite a broad picture of the findings. I read over 100 peer-reviewed scientific journals, articles, and papers, just so you did not have to. And I'll try to summarize it, but I encourage you to read the report because there's a lot more detail in there. So overall, we know that we can anticipate that with climate change, warm and dry conditions are expected to increase, and the fire season is going to become a little bit more acute in terms of intensity, but also extended in terms of the months in which we can expect forest fires to happen. We know that intact forests are naturally resilient, and while that is fairly obvious in the case of our temperate rainforests, I think what was interesting and slightly counterintuitive finding of this report is actually that more recent science is telling us that it's not only just the dripping wet intact rainforests that are more resilient, but also this also applies to dry forests. Interior forests and boreal forests tend to be more naturally resilient to fires. So why is that? Well, we have this cool, moist microclimate that's created, and that can be very obvious when you see some of the patterns of where forest fires extend to. Areas that are more moist and that have got a more intact overstory tend to be spared compared to areas that have been recently logged or in recent stages of reestablishment. So there are a number of different factors that go into creating fire risk, and both in terms of the frequency and intensity. And that is best summarized by this triangle. And so in order to have a fire, you need fuel on the ground, you need heat, and the higher temperature, obviously, the more likely things are going to burn. And then ultimately you need a spark. What sets it off? So in the case of recently clear-cut area, we know that there's a large percentage of the residual material is left on site. Sometimes upwards of 60% of the dead wood is left on site without an overstory that is more exposed to sun, dries out. So it's no surprise that this provides quite a bit of fuel that is now desiccated and dried out like a tinderbox. In terms of the spark, we know that, going back to that road network, we now have a much greater reach of where humans can go to and incidentally or accidentally cause fires. Approximately 50% of forest fires are human sparked versus about a half lightning sparked. So where those road networks have extended, it does increase the likelihood. One thing that I didn't mention here is that wind speed is also a factor. And I noted that several publications document that wind speeds tend to increase where there's extensive clear cutting, where there's no natural breaks for the wind. So here we have a fire service photo of a fire ripping through a clear cut and a water on it. This is somewhat anecdotal, but I've heard from Forest Service managers when they see a forest fire approaching a clear cut, they brace for a bit of a bomb to go off because of all that dry wood that has been left behind. It's just ready to go. Whereas where they see a fire approaching intact forest that is moist and cooler, it tends to have a deadening effect. Now, going back to that biogeoclimatic map, we know that there are fire areas where fires are natural and even as they've been suppressed for a long time. But overall, regardless of whether it's a dry fire prone forest or not, areas that have been logged are more likely to burn within that area. So very relevant for today's discussion, because I saw that we have a number of municipal representatives on this webinar. They are probably more familiar than anybody about the risks that communities face related to fires. I think that it's worth a deeper exploration here. But what I saw in the literature is that there is a real case to be made that older, more mature forests tend to be less likely to burn. And so if you're in a municipality that has very young second growth forests adjacent, this could pose a risk. And conversely, if you have the opportunity to keep forests intact, you could be well placed to mitigate this exposure to risk, particularly as the climate continues to get warmer. That can provide a buffering effect. So why is this? Well, we know that second growth and young trees in general, they tend to be a little bit more vulnerable. They're more likely to be vulnerable to being killed by fire. They have less of that ability to maintain a canopy that can retain moisture, that can sort of act as that sponge that absorbs water slowly, releases it slowly. It's more likely to lead to a crown fire. So as opposed to a low intensity ground fire, the branches actually act like a ladder. It's called ladder fuel. So as branches that are low to the ground in second growth, they can literally act as a ladder up to the canopy. And then, as you can see in this photo, that can result in a catastrophic crown fire. So in older forests, you have, the branches just physically start higher up. You can have forests that are adapted to accommodating low ground fires that can sweep through, that can clean out the brush and not arrive at a catastrophic fire. Number of really great sources on this. I would highlight this one paper by Zald and Dunn. It really sets out what we know about how forest management and fire severity. So they looked at quite a wide sampling of where fire happens, and particularly in the Pacific Northwest. And they found that where management is intense in short rotations, clear-cut industrial forestry, the fire severity and incidence increased dramatically. We can probably all recall the fire that happened in September 2020. We had a lot of smoke up here. So that was found to be over 70% of those fires burned through industrial forestry areas. So those areas, again, have a large amount of dry fuel available, and they have a lot of young second growth trees that were highly flammable. We're switched now to looking at water, and we know that will come of no surprise to many municipalities here that logging does increase the risk of water-related catastrophes, including flooding and landslides. And I think this was one was particularly surprising, that this BC's climate risk assessment did not consider how logging can play a role, given that we've had very high profile reports from areas like Peachland, Glade, and others regarding the impacts of logging on their water. So here's a nice infographic, but this sort of sets out some basics here. So we know that intact forests are very good at retaining their root systems. We've got so much steep topography in BC that these root systems really are all sometimes that's holding the soil to the sides of these slopes. So it's no surprise that when the forest goes, the water becomes more turbid. We're more likely to have very punctuated peak flows of water, and as opposed to a more mitigated, moderated flow throughout the year. So that results in too much water at some times of the year and not enough water and droughts at other times of the year. And we know that there's some municipalities, such as Peachland, they've been facing costs associated with increased water treatment that's necessary. But what's really shocking is that some of these water treatment plants that have had to be introduced because of the clear cutting in the watershed, some of these treatment plants aren't even effective anymore, because the turbidity kind of captures the pathogens, and they're not able to keep it clean. Here's some examples. I mean, you can see where forest roads go, it tends to release slides. Here we have 273 landslides triggered after a 4-day storm. This is in Clayoquot Sound in '96. So you can see how obvious the impacts are there. So we have lots of opportunity to protect and restore resilience. There's an incredible body of literature that I'm not going to be able to summarize here, but we know a lot about what it takes to restore an ecosystem. It's just can be really expensive and labor intensive, but we know what that looks like, and we know that it is possible. But it's even better if we are able to keep the forest intact to begin with, and consider those financial obligations that will come if we do have to restore the forest. We know that logging is increasingly happening in community watersheds, and that's because a function of basically the forest industry is running out of places to log, and increasingly they're starting to have to go into areas that were previously considered somewhat off limits. So we could see in the future more and more logging in community watersheds. This is incredibly important, because this is happening at the same time that the climate impacts will start to be more severe, with increased precipitation, more sort of punctuated flooding events. The BC Auditor General came down quite hard on the government that there has been no drinking water protection plans put in place, despite there having been 16 years since the report was written. So one possibility that offers quite a bit of hope is the reintroduction of Indigenous knowledge and fire management, cultural burning practices. So this was a tool that was used for millennia, but was restricted for quite some time. It's just now beginning to take hold again and be practiced, and I think that holds quite a bit of potential here. This is something that the BC Climate Risk Assessment has acknowledged, that overall that report has not engaged with First Nations adequately to date, and they're aware of that. So just to wrap up, the recommendations here, first and foremost, there must be greater engagement with Indigenous decision makers. Just overall, there hasn't been much consultation or engagement to date. And secondly, I was amazed at how closely the old growth strategic review recommendations map on to what we know in terms of the science of how best to reduce the risks associated with logging. And that comes from fundamental paradigm shift that they are calling for. If we prioritize forest ecosystem integrity, we cover off multiple problems. If you're prioritizing forest ecosystem integrity, you're taking care of the flooding risk, the fire risk. In addition, you're covering off for biodiversity values and ensuring that the carbon is retained in forests, and it continues to be a tool to fight climate change. So we need to act quickly. We know that we're losing our last remaining forests, so we need to have the safeguarding of these climate resilient forests, particularly where they're adjacent to community watersheds, but across the board. And we need to have a plan to restore second growth forests with a view to, again, reducing risk. We know that there needs to be greater consideration of forest management within any kind of strategy that's designed to mitigate risk in BC. And ultimately, we need some kind of accountability, because the forest managers, the district managers, the chief forester, the minister of forests, they're held to performance criteria, and these findings really show we need to have a different set of accountability metrics. So what does it look like in terms of those numbers that we can, the metrics that would hold people accountable, and having a climate risk impact test would be, I think, part of that. And finally, reducing emissions across all sectors, because if we end up in a situation with out of control, runaway climate change, no amount of mitigation measures will be able to stop some of these risks. We've got the deferrals that are recommended by the old growth panel, and we've got this report now that I think provides a starting point, but by no means is this comprehensive. There's a lot of information out there, and the government needs to do, I think, their own research. I've provided a list of, I think, 135 different sources that provide a really good starting point, but they need to build on that. And I believe Jens is going to speak about this, but just today, the government has announced a climate preparedness and adaptation strategy with a public consultation period open August 12th. So that's another opportunity to provide feedback. And that is it for me. I will hand it back over. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you for doing all of that work and writing this report. It's really a wonderful resource. And if you haven't had the opportunity to check it out, I think Maya has already put a link in the chat, but we can put it again for people who maybe have joined a bit later. So up next, I would like to invite my colleague Jens Wieting, who's our Senior Forest and Climate Campaigner and Science Advisor, to discuss what can local governments do to build pressure. So welcome, Jens.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much, Elizabeth and Peter, for walking us through your report. I'm joining you from Vancouver, from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and I'm going to follow up directly where Peter left off and talk a little bit more about the urgency to act, how little time we have left, and if little bit more on what exactly local governments can do, how they can engage. But first, the urgency. So I would like to start with this quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer. Many of you know her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And she says, in some native languages, the term for plants translates to those who take care of us. And we are making it incredibly difficult for plants, for forests to take care of us. So as you know, and as Peter mentioned, we have already logged the vast majority of the productive forests, which are most critical to reduce these impacts. And that was a problem for a long time, but it's really becoming more severe. And it's a growing threat because things are speeding up. So having many landscapes across BC looking like this is a huge challenge. It was always a huge challenge, but it's now becoming really dangerous. So we have lived with a stable climate for thousands of years. We can use this moment to reflect about the approximately 10,000 years since the last ice age and how we benefited from a stable climate and had indigenous cultures coexisting with ecosystems without undermining their integrity, and the rapid change that has unfolded since settlers arrived in this part of the world. And this is now overlapping with this massive increase, with this massive warming trend. This graphics one version of the hockey stick, and it's a few years old, it's already outdated. As you can see, for 10,000 years, relatively stable climate, and we are now quickly moving into uncharted territory here. And that blue part showing the reconstructed temperature is already moving up above the one degree of warming and quickly approaching 1.5. And just a reminder that all of this is overlapping with the destruction of habitat and species extinction. So we cannot save a stable climate without intact forest, and we cannot save intact forest without a stable climate. So we really have to act quickly, following through with the paradigm shift, slow down climate change by keeping more carbon in the forest, preventing the carbon source from becoming bigger, protect communities from climate impacts. And this means that these two things must be paramount in our climate action strategies. We really helps to think about mitigation and adaptation for all governments, whether a provincial government or all levels of local and regional governments. So we are usually thinking about emissions, but we also should think about climate impacts in this context, because we can both reduce, to some degree, reduce the impacts, and then we have to prepare, we have to adapt to those impacts we cannot stop, we cannot fully prevent. And as you know, we're talking about intervention to reduce emissions, in this case also to reduce impacts, and adaptation, the adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. So the initial response from the BC government, just very quickly, was actually rather concerning. They welcomed Peter's report with media comments, but it was a little bit confusing to read that they were looking at this in the context of strengthening clean BC and planting trees, when really what the report is about is protecting the remaining intact forests and restoring forests. And it was very clear that there's a lot more work to do for all of us, including local governments, to make sure that the BC government fully considers this report and really uses the information to amend the existing strategy, the existing assessment, and develop more comprehensive strategies. And as Peter said, the old growth panel report is incredibly helpful in this context, because it's not only highlighting the urgency to protect remaining intact forests, it's also calling for a paradigm shift in terms of management across all lands, all forests, with a 3-year framework. Most of you are familiar with this. This is the 3-year timeline, which is incredibly important to address the urgency. This is on page 68 of the panel report. And a reminder how we are not seeing the accountability that we need in this context. So this is a report card that we shared in March 11. You can find it on our in our media center on the Sierra Club website. So as you know, we have serious delays in terms of the immediate deferrals for at-risk forests. We have a little bit of a work plan now, 21, 22, 23, and the intentions paper the other week, but no detail on milestones, and we have not seen the funding to speed up the transition, and we have not seen the change in the bureaucracy to make sure that from day one we start to make changes in terms of how cut permits are being issued to make sure that we are not losing more of the remaining at-risk forests, and to make it easier to prevent and reduce those climate risks. There's a lot of work to do in terms of transparency and communication. Most importantly, I think local governments have to organize their response and their call for assistance from the BC government, looking at the following steps. So we already talked about the importance of following through with the old growth strategic review. This is something that all local governments can help with by pushing for local deferrals, Indigenous governments and municipalities working together, for example. And there's an opportunity to implement DRIPA, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and reform decision-making to be more prepared for these increasingly severe risks. That means that by reforming decision-making, communities have to take back some power to make sure that they can defend their long-term safety and well-being, reducing these climate risks as much as possible. And the BC government has to help local governments at every level with better information, so that local governments have a better chance to fully understand these risks and prepare for them. Lastly, this will require more funding. Your local governments will need support to strengthen local capacity to fully understand these risks, work with the more than 100 papers that Peter compiled to assess how can they be used, how can this information be used locally to understand local risks and better prepare for them, including monitoring of local logging plans and impacts. So again, just today, the BC government shared this paper, the Climate Preparedness and Adaptation Strategy, open for comments until August 12. Here's a quote from the media release today. In phase 1 of the draft Climate Preparedness and Adaptation Strategy, the province will work with Indigenous nations and local governments to strengthen community resilience, begin work on a BC flood strategy, improve the provincial response to extreme heat and wildfire smoke, assess climate impacts on vulnerable highway, culverts, and resource roads. So public communication open until August 12th, and I think this is an incredibly important opportunity for local governments, all concerned citizens to engage, because there's a high level of urgency here. So we have a lot of common ground. There's a lot of conflict, as you know, but we have a lot of common ground with our shared love for the forests and the trees. There's a desire to support families, save meaningful jobs, protecting the web of life, implementing the rights of indigenous peoples, safeguard the carbon sink, reducing these risks, create more jobs and less damage for every tree cut, keep processing local, create value-added products, ensure forests support a diverse long-term economy, not short-term profit, and ensure that wealth from the trees, from the forest, stays in the community. But I think we really have to give our heads a shake in terms of how deep in the hole we are, and we really cannot solve this crisis without treating it as a crisis. So with this, I will pass it on to Flossie for a few more options on how local governments can use some of our resources.
Thanks so much, Jens. Really appreciate that. And I definitely hope that we can count on everyone on the webinar today to submit your comments, particularly as they do pertain to your local community. It's essential that the province doesn't hear just from Sierra Club BC. They really do need to hear feedback from across the province on how this would impact your community. Okay, welcome, Flossie. We're going to switch gears now. Flossie Baker is our lead organizer, and she will talk about what we can do from here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. So, hi everyone. I understand that there are a bunch of municipal leaders on this call today and a bunch of people who are not. So I'm about to run through a series of suggestions that I think are really applicable, whether you are a municipal leader or not. And the first one is to hold a listening session. And this one sounds super simple, but I can't really overstate the importance of it enough. There just are not enough people out there who are willing to hold space for these really difficult conversations to occur. And a listening session is a tool that we've been using, and it really is just exactly what it says on the tin, an opportunity for folks to gather, to share their feelings, to share their good and bad experiences of the ways that logging practices have influenced their communities. And they're really the places where stories are surfaced that help make this issue personal to people. And so I really encourage you to go away and hold some this summer with your friends, with the circle that you're a part of. And if you want any support with that, please let me know. Maya will be putting my contact information in the chat. Providing spaces for people to just hear each other is so badly needed at all levels right now. And it's really critical to building the resiliency that we need in the face of climate change. So amongst all the urgency, also listen. The second thing that I really encourage you to do is to pass municipal resolutions this summer. So as we've heard, local municipalities can play a huge role in helping to bring about the shift in forestry reform that we so badly need. It's municipalities, after all, that tend to end up picking up the tab when poor logging practices damage water supplies, salmon runs, increase wildfires, or cause flooding that damage homes. So the price is borne on us. And as a municipality, you can pass resolutions to call the provincial government to enact all 14 recommendations. If you're a municipal leader on this call today and your municipality has not yet passed a resolution, please try and make this happen this summer. And if you are not a municipal leader, help your municipality to do this. It's really important that you meet with them and inspire and support them to do it. And again, if you'd like help with this, reach out to me or Elizabeth, and we can gladly sit with you and help refine the ask, build the relationship, and tell some powerful stories. Number 3, September the 11th is the 1-year anniversary of the Old Growth Strategic Review. And so we at Sierra Club are really gearing up to a big forest week of action around that date. And we are going to be building momentum for it all summer long. Each day of that week of action, we hope to engage a different group of people, and you can see the groups at the bottom of my screen. So we really want to spend a day really engaging artists, whether that's painters or musicians or dancers, benefactors, donors, ambassadors. So this is people who, I call them the social butterflies. They like to maybe hold parties or picnics. And then we also want to engage nurturers. So the nurturers group is for anyone who is raising children at this time. You're already doing the most important job. We just want to help you do that in a way that also helps shift forestry reform. And then the final group is innovators. And so that's for folks who have an idea for action and they don't necessarily see it reflected here. But we will help do our best to support you to bring it to life. And so my ask is that you go to the link that Maya is about to put in the chat, you sign up for one of these groups, and we look forward to getting to know you better over the summer. We will be inviting you to art classes, walks on the land, storytelling sessions, all in advance and building up to September's week of action and beyond. Deep breath. And finally, sign our petition. Maya's putting it in the chat. The petition is calling on the provincial government to take our health and safety seriously by enacting the 14 recommendations. And on that note, I'll pass it back to Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Flossie. And I do hope that some of you will check out invitetoaction.ca and help build relationships with us. So we have a number of excellent questions that have come in from the audience. And so I will go through them now and we'll decide who the best person on the panel will be to answer them. So the first question is, logging slash is fuel for wildfire. Yes, yet it's also essential soil nutrient and insect, bird, and other habitat. Do you have any comment about the impacts of removing slash and or using it for a quote unquote biofuel? Peter or Jens, would you like to address that?
I'm happy to address that.
Great.
So yeah, you're absolutely right. Coarse woody debris, absolutely essential for habitat. Overall logging, particularly in logging in old growth forest, it creates very high amounts of coarse woody debris, far higher than what is natural. And this can, again, prevent regrowth. It can create a fire risk. And so that's why, government requires that this be burned off in these big slash piles. That releases massive amounts of carbon for absolutely no energy capture. So it's tempting to say, okay, well, it's better to capture that in the form of energy. But I think the bigger picture is that you need to first focus on maintaining ecosystem health and integrity as the first priority. So that's looking at what kind of animals require coarse woody debris in terms of their habitat requirements. And then, you can look for areas where, particularly in second growth logging, there's a possibility where the byproducts from harvesting could be used for energy. But right now we're seeing a pellet industry that's actually quite willing to use whole trees, and they are buying whole trees for processing, which is quite alarming as a trend. So overall, not very supportive of that going forward.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, we're definitely not pleased with what we've seen with the wood pellet industry. It does not look like an ecological benefit at all. The next question, can logging of coastal forests increase the risk of interior drought due to reduced evapotranspiration and therefore reduce cloud formation to move water further inland?
I would say that overall, we know that the forests are creating their own little microsystems. They're retaining water. And I know that we've seen, for example, the Amazon creates these rivers of moisture that act as this pump, and it goes over to create the rainforest of the Congo Basin. I don't know actually if the same dynamic is at play between Vancouver Island and the interior. I'd be surprised if there is some kind of dynamic where that moisture is being fed. That's a really excellent question. I'm super curious to find out now if that's
Jens,
the case.
do you have any idea?
Well, I know that there is a paper, and I think it's written by Russian scientists, that see evidence that unless there is forest or other vegetation along a coast, it will impact the amount of rain. About 700 kilometer inwards is the maximum distance that rain can still be produced, even if there's no vegetation nearby. But if you remove vegetation, there's an impact. But I'm not sure whether there's consensus about this. I know that this is being discussed in Peter Wohlleb's book about the secret lives of trees. He's quoting this.
Great, thank you so much. Here's a question that I've heard before. Do you think the government is setting up these public consultations in good faith? There was a FERPA consultation and the PMFLA public consultation, and then the Old Growth Strategic Review. And it often seems like they're ignoring all of those because they're not actually getting the feedback that's in favor of the industry. And I know we have to engage anyway, but it feels like an exercise in futility. You know, personally, I agree, you have to engage anyway. And, you know, to a certain degree, there is quite a bit of momentum when running a government. Do you have anything you'd like to add to that, Jens?
Yes, I think I absolutely share the concern. I mean, we are incredibly frustrated because we have asked our supporters again and again to share comments on species at risk legislation, on FERPA amendments, on old growth recommendations, and we have not seen the change. So there's a big concern, but it really matters how many people participating and who is participating. So if we can have more local governments from all parts of the province and First Nations from all parts of the province and many others from, in some cases, unusual background, faith groups and many others, that will really help. So the number of people, the number of groups, governments and so on can make a difference. And as you can see, the concern has now reached a level where we see a lot of civil disobedience, a lot of conflict in the woods, and that all combined will make a difference, because at some point people are not satisfied anymore with sending letters. It's kind of a logical development that nobody should be too surprised that this is happening after years of frustration.
Yeah. Flossie, could you speak a little bit about the listening circle as a tool that, you know, would help these other public consultation sessions that the province is setting up, and how listening can help communities sort of build that power to actually provide meaningful input?
Yeah, I mean, it's super simple, really. But the main way that I see these listening circles maybe being just really supportive of what municipal leaders are trying to do for forests is that very often, if folks get a meeting with their MLA, they'll just go alone, and I mean, that's great, but they could be so much more effective. And they would be more effective if they could take other people who are not like them from the community. And very often that does mean that relationship building has to happen. So if you can walk into a meeting with an MLA or any kind of decision maker with people who are not like you and people who represent different parts of that community, maybe someone representing a business association, a faith group, a school, a youth, you're just going to have way more impact. And so I found that these listening circles or listening sessions or house meetings, whatever you want to call them, are just a really great way to build that sense of trust between people who may not normally cross paths with each other. And the thing about asking folks to share their story and why it's personal to them is that once you've heard that, you can't forget it. And people, it's just a very effective way of building trust quite quickly. And I can talk way more detail to anyone who is at least the smallest bit interested in holding one of these, because I think they're just such satisfying work and a really good way to keep grounded in the midst of, you know, when things can feel so despairing and overwhelming.
Thanks, Flossie. That's really helpful. Here's a comment from our friend Eve. Do you have any comments on the absence of regulatory measures to phase out clear cutting and phase in partial or selective cutting?
Well,
I don't know. Yes, you want to take that?
and you, of course, you can add, but one thing I will point out is that one of the most exciting things I saw in the Old Growth Strategic Review that few people talk about is that it talks about reforming forestry, including alternatives to clear cutting. And there is an acknowledgement that the impacts of industrial logging have been too severe, and based on the science, we have only reviewed a little bit of it in this hour, but looking at the combined value, looking at the carbon sink and the defense for communities from these increasingly severe climate risks, it's not rocket science, it's simple. Continuing the current model has more negative impacts compared to the remaining benefits. If we look at the economic shifts, and if we consider that the vast majority of jobs and economic activity today is no longer dependent on resource extraction, but other economic activity, we simply cannot afford to destroy the web of life, destroy the last defense we have against some of these potentially catastrophic climate impacts to maintain the current model. So with the panel report, we have a blueprint for solutions, including completely reforming the way we are doing forestry in BC, and we better use this chance and insist that it will be fully implemented and not in a token way. The 3-year framework works. If we wait too long, the negative impacts will quickly overrun our capacity to respond and reform things in an orderly fashion. So I really hope we can work with this, and definitely have to call for full implementation.
I might just build on that. I think that there's these economics of forestry at play here, and why clear cutting is cheap. It gets this maximum amount of fiber off of a given mountain, right? So if you're going to introduce alternative measures and lower impact measures, it comes in light of those economics. So overall, what we see is that the price of lumber that we charge in terms of the stumpage rate is very, very low. And that if we really want to make alternatives viable, we have to make sure that the regulations are set in a consistent way that makes it economic to do the right thing, right? And this actually ties in with a couple other questions I'm seeing in the chat. around, the viability of community forest models and the viability of doing things like pre-commercial thinning. And the truth is, we could do it. We know how to do these things. But the community forestry right now is competing with these very high impact producers. And unless we level the playing field there, while I think it's great community forests will try to do lower impact logging, they're always going to have the deck stacked against them. So I think particularly in light of the fact that timber prices have now quadrupled in the past year, this might be a good opportunity to introduce things that might cost a little bit more to do, but are the right thing for the forest.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. We have two more questions that I want to try and get to here. The first one was asked earlier on, which was that this person was astonished that John Horgan and Katrina Conroy presented their new intentions paper on forestry, and there was no mention of climate risks. Was there even a climate scientist involved in creating that forestry plan? My hunch is no, because it feels like there's been quite a separation in the way that ministry is functioning, separate from climate. They are separate ministries. Do you know what the answer to that is, Jens?
Well, I can only agree that it's a huge concern, and the paper is superficial. It's not dealing with the crisis like we should. There's too much emphasis on timber values and volume, and it's a good step to talk about redistributing tenure. But this must be based on respecting the ecological limits and the climate crisis, the climate science, and that hasn't happened. So looking at climate action, this is an example of denial. There was no work done in the intentions paper to fully acknowledge the scope and scale of the change we need in terms of carbon emissions from forests and reducing climate risks.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And we have less than a minute left, so I don't know we'll dig into this fully, but this person said that they passed a resolution and wrote to the Premier calling for implementation of the Old Growth Panel recommendations, and that prompted a delegation from the Truck Loggers Association. And are we working with industry, and if so, is any common ground being achieved? Jens, can you talk a little bit about what we've done with labor and industry?
Well, there are a number of examples where progressive unions like the private and public workers of Canada are calling for change, both in terms of moving away from raw log exports, making sure that we have more value-added products, and protecting old growth forests. But overwhelmingly, we are very concerned about the other unions and industry working hand in hand with the BC government, defending business as usual as much as possible. And we need a lot more change within industry, within all unions, to make sure that we can actually really discuss solutions that work long term and not just for a few more years under the current paradigm.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I know that as COVID restrictions are eased and we have more opportunities to meet with people face to face, those difficult conversations are much easier to have when we're sitting in a room and actually looking at each other, as opposed to arguing on social media, where sometimes it seems quite fruitless. Okay, we are at time. It's 3 o'clock. I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank all of our panelists for your time today. I hope that all of us can continue to work together to protect our communities and to protect our intact forests. Again, if you want a copy of the physical report, you can email me at gifts@sierraclub.bc.ca, or you can find it online at sierraclub.bc.ca/intact-forests. Feel free to reach out to us at any time if you do have other questions, and I invite you to continue the conversation on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @sierraclub.bc or sierraclubbc. And then, of course, we are 100% funded through donations and grants from the generosity of people like you. So thank you all for being here, for supporting our work. And if you would like to make a donation, please do so at sierraclub.bc.ca/donate. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great afternoon.